Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Michelle D'Amico, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education and Public Programs at the NYU SPS Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. Since its founding, our goal at CGA has been to prepare global citizens to make a positive impact in the world. We do this through our two graduate programs, one in global affairs and our recently launched MS in global security, conflict, and cybercrime. We also offer a variety of professional and personal enrichment courses in the areas of global affairs and fundraising. This includes several professional certificates. And we host free public events such as this that expand upon the critical issues and timely topics that we cover in our classrooms. We'll send out a follow-up message to all attendees, so please feel free to reach out with any questions you may have about these programs. We've also reserved some time at the end of today's event for questions from the audience. Please submit your questions via the Q&A tool. Now to tonight's moderator. CGA Clinical Professor Michael F. Oppenheimer leads the IR Futures concentration at CGA, teaching courses on international relations, the future of international relations, and US foreign policy. He also oversees an ongoing research and consulting project for the UN Security Council's Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, which involves students directly in advising the UN system on counterterrorism policies and practices. He has consulted for the US intelligence community, the Department of State, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the UN, and many others. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and his latest book is Pivotal Countries, Alternate Futures, published by Oxford University Press in 2015. And now, without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Michael.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome to all of you, and especially to Charles Kupchan. It's a great honor to have Charles here to talk about his new book on isolationism. Just a little bit of background. Charles is a professor of international affairs in the School of Foreign Service and Government Department at Georgetown University. He's also a longtime senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2014 to 2017, he served in the Obama administration as special assistant to the president of the National Security Council. He was also on the NSC during the Clinton administration. He's a prolific author. His books are essential for anyone teaching or studying international relations and foreign policy. He's published The End of the American Era, How Enemies Become Friends, and No One's World. The topic for today is his most recent book, published quite recently on isolationism in the history of American foreign policy. So, you know, many welcomes, and Charlie, and it's great to have you. You know, the normal place to start here is just to ask you, you know, to take a few minutes to try to sort of summarize the argument in the book. This is a book of history, but it's also one of policy advocacy. It's an interesting blend. So what are you arguing in the book?
Well, thanks very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to join you, and thanks to Michelle and the Center for hosting tonight. You know, my only regret is that we're doing this several hundred miles apart. It would be great to do this in person, so maybe we can plan on a rain check once conditions permit.
You bet.
I'm going to relate the book to where we are politically and discuss the core arguments in the book in the context of the transition from President Trump to President Biden, to kind of bring it home and give people a sense of the implications of the analysis that I offer in the book, which is largely historical. I would say, you know, 90% of the book is on American history. Most of it is on pre-Pearl Harbor American history, and I'll say a few things about that in a second. But the core of the argument that I want to make tonight is that we've been through two big periods, two eras in American statecraft. The first ran from 1789 to 1941, and I would call this the era of isolationism, in which the United States was very avid about international trade, was culturally engaged, diplomatically engaged. Its missionaries were roaming around everywhere, but it essentially wanted to stay out of strategic entanglement beyond the homeland. First beyond North America, and then after 1898 beyond the Western Hemisphere. And if there was one explanation for the staying power of isolationism, it was the American understanding of its exceptionalism. And from the founding fathers on, they believed that the United States could best preserve its unique experiment in political and economic liberty by tending its own garden. And they believed that foreign ambition would come at the expense of liberty and prosperity at home. That, in many respects, was the wellspring of the isolationist trajectory of the country. That all stops on December 7, 1941, which begins the second big period in American statecraft, and that's the era of liberal internationalism, where we swung to the opposite extreme. We had hundreds of thousands of troops during World War II overseas. They stayed on station after the end of the war. We still have over 700 military bases all over the world. And this was in many respects a different version of American exceptionalism, in which we began to believe that we could preserve our experiment only by taking it to the rest of the world. We took manifest destiny on the road. And this was the era of what we now call Pax Americana, unstinting American internationalism. I believe that we're now entering the third era of American statecraft. And I think the challenge for President Biden is to find a middle ground between era one, the era of isolationism, and era two, the era of liberal internationalism, which for many Americans led to overreach. I think during the Cold War, the US more or less got it right. We outlasted the Soviet Union through patience, not through overreach. There were some excesses during the Cold War, but I think we generally got it right. Starting in the 1990s, however, with the end of the Cold War and the so-called end of history, and then the wars of 9/11, we ended up trying to do too much. And I think Trump came to office in part because he ran on a platform that was sensitive to the sense among many Americans that there was too much world and not enough America. Too many wars, too much free trade, too many immigrants, too many international pacts and alliances. And Trump, in many respects, was hearkening back to an earlier era in American statecraft, and he did so explicitly. America First was calling forth the America First Committee formed in 1940 to keep the United States out of World War II. But, and this is an important but, Trump vastly overcorrected. Instead of realigning American commitments and American means and purposes, he took a wrecking ball to the world America made. He isolated the United States in an era in which we are irretrievably tethered to a globalized world. And so what I see the task for Biden is to correct for Trump's overcorrection, to find that middle ground, to step back without stepping away, to trim American foreign commitments, but not to run away from them. So let me just take a couple more minutes to give you some sense of how I arrived at this argument, and then look forward to the conversation with you, Michael, and with the participants on the call. You know, I began to sense that we as Americans needed to know more about the isolationist era of American history. First in the 1990s, when I noticed that coverage of foreign policy started to fall off a cliff, and then after the wars of 9/11, when clearly we began to tire of what we now call the forever wars: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. We spent about $6 trillion in those wars, and quite honestly, we don't have much good to show for it. And I think it's that reality that to some extent pushed me to say, well, wait a minute, maybe the era of internationalism in which I grew up could prove to be the exception and not the rule in American history. And that's when I started to really go back and look at the 19th century, the early 20th century, the founding era. And I began to realize that George Washington pretty much said it all in 1796 in his farewell address when he said, the nation should have commercial connections with everyone and political connections with no one. And successive generations generally followed that wisdom until Pearl Harbor. Right? We then have, as I mentioned, this reaction against what many Americans took to be overreach. And that led to, in my mind, the Trump era, along with the economic discontent that we've been living through. And so I see the task before Biden to, number one, correct for overcorrection. I think he's right to go back to international teamwork. He's right to go back to standing by American values and by human rights, but he should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Much of what Trump began to do, Biden should continue to do. Pull back from the Middle East and reduce the US footprint there. 3/4 of the American public wants out of Afghanistan and Iraq tonight. He should ease off on the trade agenda. Free trade did great things for a small number of Americans, but didn't do much for a large number of working Americans who've seen their wages decline and their manufacturing jobs disappear. I think we now live in an era in which the institutionalized multilateralism will be much harder to come by than it used to be, in part because it's going to be very difficult to get any kind of treaties ratified through the Senate. And that says to me, more ad hoc coalitions, more informal pacts, more executive agreements, teamwork, yes, but probably not through these big formalized institutions of the post-World War II Cold War era. So as I said, I think Biden has to trim without stepping away. That is to say, step back without stepping away. And I also, and this will be my final introductory comment, I want to reinforce the degree to which the United States today has a domestic agenda that is so pressing that it cannot but come at the expense of ambition abroad. And the founders were right about this. You know, we have lived through the scariest 4 years of my life when it comes to American politics. I think Biden meant it when he said, this is an election for the soul of America. But when you look at pandemic relief, investment in infrastructure, investment in healthcare and childcare and manufacturing and green technology, we're talking trillions and trillions of dollars. The United States will get its foreign policy right only if it gets its domestic house in order. And that's why, for me, the first, second, and third, and fourth priorities for President Biden are to fix the country's problems at home. Because only if it succeeds in that task will we be able to be strong and purposeful abroad.
No, that's terrific. Thank you, Charlie. Of course, the world might not wait. In particular, one thinks of the China challenge and whether events with respect to Taiwan, Hong Kong, South China Seas, etc., might not give the U.S. the luxury of fixing these domestic problems. So, you know, I guess I would ask in this kind of a compromise between isolationism and global engagement that I think you've outlined. You know, how do you keep the ship of state steering sort of through the straight and narrow? And what kind of thinking is necessary to accomplish that? And also, I guess, what kind of policy process is essential to doing that right? I mean, you've been inside that process. You know how hard it is, even with a grand strategy that is relatively demanding, but relatively simple, at least conceptually. what you've outlined is more complex, I think, requires more choices. How do you make that work?
Well, I think for starters, you realize that strength abroad relies on strength at home. And Biden, I think, gets this. You know, he gave a speech at the State Department on February 4th, where he explicitly said, there is no longer a bright line between domestic policy and foreign policy. We need a foreign policy that works for the middle class. And so I think he understands that. The question is, will he succeed in implementing that? And a lot of that has to do with domestic investment. A lot of it has to do with getting right his agenda here at home. And that will give him the political wind in the sails and perhaps the measure of bipartisan support that he needs to practice more steady statecraft abroad. And on process, I do think that it would make sense, and maybe this is beginning to happen today because Susan Rice, who was the National Security Advisor, is now the head of the Domestic Policy Council. But we need to break down the stovepiping and the barriers between the conduct of national security policy and the conduct of domestic policy, in part because we've seen the degree to which, during the Trump era, our foreign policy can go down a rabbit hole, in part because of domestic divisions and domestic discontent. So I do think we need to make sure that in the government, the domestic side of the house and the foreign side of the house are doing a better job. The other point I would make here is the importance of trimming, but not too much. You know, I'm struck by the degree to which among our colleagues, Michael, prominent academics are now calling for the United States to come home. They're now saying, let's get out of Europe, let's go offshore in Asia. It's enough already. And that's not where I am. I'm someone who thinks the US has bent the arc of history in the right direction since its founding. It needs to continue to play that role. But I fear that if we don't trim, if we don't focus on the domestic front, if we continue to overreach, we will face a popular backlash that does cause a dangerous turning inward. In other words, dangerous overreach has the potential to turn into even more dangerous underreach. And that's why I think we need to get ahead of the curve and shape a grand strategy that does constitute this new equilibrium, that does less, but still does enough. And for me, the way to begin to do that is to avoid these wars of choice in the strategic periphery that grind us down, and to go back to where George Kennan was in the 1940s, which is to focus on the defense of core democratic areas of power in Eurasia, in Europe and East Asia, and continue to check Russia and China because of the threat that they pose to those core areas. Let's go back to basics.
Yeah. I mean, you described your overall approach as one of selective engagement. That means that you engage where you think your primary interests are involved, and you jettison commitments that you deem peripheral. We've been saying to each other for a very long time that the Middle East, for various reasons, is increasingly peripheral. It's dangerous, as demonstrated many times over the last decade or so, but it's also less important. And yet, both recent presidents, including one that you work for, found it very difficult to follow that logic. So are we going to go through another, kind of a process here of talking about the advantages of retrenchment in the Middle East and then failing to follow through?
You're right to say that this conversation that you and I are having right now really does go back to the Obama era. And Obama, I think, came into office as a retrenchment president. He wanted to do less. He wanted allies to do more. He thought that American exceptionalism had kind of led us to do too much. He kind of wanted to husband resources. You may recall that his campaign slogan when he ran for re-election was, "It's time for nation building here at home." But he was frustrated. He was frustrated because Afghanistan wouldn't let go. And then the Islamic State comes charging back in Syria and in Iraq, and suddenly we've got troops fighting in both of those countries. And that, I think, in part led to Trump. And Trump also tried and ran up against a buzzsaw of pushback from the Pentagon and from the foreign policy establishment. And that's why, in the end of the day, he kind of started to withdraw rashly. You may recall that his withdrawal from northern Syria occurred one night when he hung up the phone after Erdogan had been yelling at him. And he just said, "I'm done with this. We're leaving. Our troops are out. You take it." And that's not how you should retrench, right? You got to have a plan. You got to have a diplomatic strategy. So now it's Biden's turn. And it's worth noting that a blue ribbon panel just concluded that Biden should increase forces in Afghanistan from 2,500 to 4,500.
Yeah.
I don't know what he's going to do, but I think it is time to face up to the fact that our strategy hasn't worked. And I think the biggest mistake we've made is believing that regime change and toppling regimes will put the Middle East in a better place. It has not. And I think we're paying for the mistakes that we made a long time ago, in particular, the toppling of Saddam Hussein.
Back to the subject of American exceptionalism, you pointed out that it is the source both of isolationist impulses as well as world order building impulses. That the constant is that we view ourselves as an exceptional country. I'm wondering, and this is purely speculative and not in the book, because you wrote the book before these awful events of January 6th and so forth, but we've taken some real hits to our self-image. 4 years of Trump, a disastrous presidency, and then an attack on the Capitol, which was essentially Trump's last act as president. Do you think Americans feel less exceptional today? I mean, and would that be a plus in kind of steering this mid-course that you've described?
I don't know whether Americans feel less exceptional. I think we feel taken down a notch because of the pandemic. We've now lost over 500,000 people. It's been quite a mess. We witnessed the siege of the seat of government, the Capitol, which has served as a beacon of democracy and the rule of law since it was built. Had not been attacked like that since the War of 1812. So yeah, we've been taken down a notch, but I'm someone who thinks that American exceptionalism is part of the American experience and part of American identity. And it, on balance, serves the country well. It helps create a sense of mission. It helps create a bipartisanship when it comes to the country's role in the world. And so I'm not someone who believes we should junk it and just say, there's nothing unique about the country. I think we have made this world that we live in a safer place, a more prosperous place, a more democratic place, a more dignified place, and we should continue to play that role. But exceptionalism has good bits and bad bits. And I was really struck. I was already writing this book when Trump came into office. And, I kind of fell off my chair as he began his presidency because the isolationism, the unilateralism, the protectionism, the nativism was all there. He was really hearkening back to this earlier version of American exceptionalism and American statecraft. I don't think he was doing it because he had read a lot of American history. He has not. I think he did it because he has an acute ability to tap into a certain strain of American political culture. He understood that in those parts of the country that backed him, this earlier version of statecraft got a lot of traction. And I'll just give you two quick stories to give you some sense of the power of these different versions of exceptionalism. We are losing the War of Independence in 1778. To put it nicely, we're getting our butts kicked by the British. And the founders did not want to look to others for help. They didn't like the idea of entanglement with others, but they said, we're going to lose. We need help from the French. We form an alliance with the French in 1778. They come over and they pull our chestnuts out of the fire. A few years later, in 1793, France and Britain go to war again. The King of France has George Washington on his speed dial. He calls George and he says, George, remember that alliance that we struck in 1778? Well, now it's your turn to help us. And this was an alliance that was still on the books. What did George Washington do? He hangs up the phone and he issues the Proclamation of Neutrality, in which he says to the French, good night and good luck. Do you know, Michael, the next time we formed a military alliance, it was after World War II. Mm. So 1793 to the late 1940s, that's quite a run. One other quick historical note. Racism and a sense of the superiority of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants was a very important part of American diplomacy and statecraft. One of the reasons that we did not expand beyond North America is that we did not want to bring non-whites into the body politic. And that had very strong anti-immigrant strains beginning in the 1880s and then peaking in the legislation of 1924 that decreased by 90% the intake of Jews and Catholics from Southern Europe. So it wasn't only non-whites, because those were whites, it was people who were not Protestant. And so there is this sense of chosenness that comes not just from the land of the American experiment, but the people that populated the United States. Mm. And here again, Trump was tapping into not just the isolationism and the unilateralism, but the kind of the sense of whiteness, of white supremacy that does have a very strong presence, especially in the 19th century and up into the post-World War II era. The 1924 legislation was not really fully revised until the Civil Rights Movement.
You pointed out in the book that the best of American policy post-World War II represents a blend of realism and liberalism, hard power and soft power, exerting an influence by ourselves when we need to, but acting collectively when we can, and so forth. Is that what you mean when you use? I think you use the words strategic retrenchment or judicious retrenchment. Is that the idea that you confront your enemies collectively if you can, but at the same time you try to build institutions that deal with emerging issues? Is that the model?
Yeah, I mean, there was a consensus behind isolationism throughout the 19th century that starts to crack in the 1890s. And the Republicans generally become the party of power and empire under McKinley and Roosevelt. And the Democrats become the party of idealism and partnership under William Jennings Bryan. And that really begins the split between Republicans and Democrats on foreign policy, which you see particularly acute in the Wilsonian era, right? Where Wilsonian is this great idealist, the League of Nations. He gets shot down by the Republicans in the big debates of the 1919 and 1920 era, in which the Republicans defeat the League of Nations. And then it really isn't until Roosevelt when you see the reconstitution of a bipartisan consensus. And what he did, as you put it, is marry idealism and realism, power and partnership. So the Republicans got their power, the Democrats got their partnership, and they met in the middle. And I think that's the right formula. It works. The US projects its power abroad, but it does so through multilateralism, through partnership, working with others. And we need to go back to that. We've lost it again. You know, ever since Clinton, the Democrats have generally become the party of partnership, the Republicans of unilateralism and the projection of power, and the political center today is on sort of life support. But I think what Biden is trying to do, and Obama really did start this, is to go back to power and partnership together, but less of both, right? Pull back, keep America engaged in the world, but get allies to do more. And the partnership part of this, Michael, is more important today than it's ever been, in part because, like, what are the top issues we need to solve today? Climate change, cybersecurity, global health, and pandemics, right? As we've been talking about, 500,000 Americans have already died. That's more than in any foreign war. The only war that we fought as a nation with that level of death is the Civil War. And so we've got all of these big agenda items out there in a globalized world. There's no way we can tackle them alone. And that's why going back to multilateralism and partnership is so important, including with countries that we may not like, right? We may have to denounce the Chinese for what they're doing in Hong Kong and Xinjiang and complain about Putin's crackdown on Navalny, but we're also going to have to accept pragmatic give and take because we're going to need their help in solving global problems.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one more question and then turn to the audience. We've been talking about our own policies and our own internal politics and whether the country as it's constituted can support a coherent strategy going forward. But then there's the way others look at us. Having experienced the Trump presidency and the withdrawal of commitments, the chaos, the incoherence, and so forth, and still witnessing a deeply polarized country. As you said earlier, we're probably not going to get too many treaties through the Senate. So, I mean, this is the question everyone's asking, of course, is how credible are our executive agreements in maintaining our commitments? And you know, how do you earn the trust? I mean, Joe Biden is saying all the right things, and you know, our allies are responding in an encouraging way because that's the rational thing to do. But underlying their response, of course, has to be the doubt that any of these commitments are, you know, for the long term. How do you overcome that?
Yeah. There's no question that most countries around the world are delighted that Biden is in the Oval Office and that the United States again has a president that is internationalist and in some ways, more importantly, is decent, believes in the rule of law, believes in democracy, believes in human rights. I don't know about you, but I'm sleeping much better than I did for the last 4 years. And I think that's true of many people in this country and abroad. But they are saying is this going to last? How reliable is the United States? And it's not just Trump, it's that we've gone from Clinton to George W. to Obama to Trump to Biden, right? It's like we can't make up our mind. And so countries are beginning to hedge. They're beginning to say, you know, maybe we shouldn't put all of our eggs in the Uncle Sam basket. And I don't blame them. That they do need to ask that kind of question. But I don't think that we're going to get it into a position in which we can start ratifying things like the Iran deal or the Paris Agreement or other agreements that we might strike, because that's just not where the Senate is these days. You know, I would go so far as to say, Michael, that, you know, if tomorrow you and I got in a cab and we went to Capitol Hill with the post-World War II settlement, the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, NATO, right? You know, they would chase us off the grounds with a baseball bat, right? That American politics is just, it's not there right now. And that's why I think that you know, the key to this is getting our politics right so that we don't have to deal with another Trump or Trumpian era. And that's why I think Biden's task here is not to turn his back on the Trump era. It's to say, what lessons can we draw? How did that happen? What can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again? And I think the answer to that is fix the country's problems domestically, because in my mind, it's primarily economic insecurity and issues that stem out from economic insecurity, inequality, and other issues that are at the heart of the politics of grievance that led to Trump, but also ease off on the foreign policy agenda, because I think Americans have tired of a country that, as I said, has spent too much time solving other people's problems and not enough time solving our own problems. So in my mind, the real solution to the problem that you're talking about is not necessarily going back and getting treaties ratified in the Senate. I don't think that's going to happen. It's to do the domestic repair that can get this country back on its feet and functioning as a normal liberal democracy should. I think we can do it. It's just going to take a lot of work.
Well, of course, I agree wholeheartedly. Okay, so let's give a chance to the audience to come in here. Michelle, you're going to manage this process for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you both. We have a lot of questions coming in. And the first is going a little bit off of what you just mentioned, Professor Kupchan, is that given the divisions that exist within the US Congress currently, what do you see as pathways forward to addressing some of the domestic changes that you've outlined as priorities for the administration?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's too soon, Michelle, to know exactly how much buy-in the president will be able to get from the Republican Party on the pandemic package, on infrastructure investment, on a host of other issues. I think Biden should try. He has the track record, he has the contacts and experience to reach across the aisle and to try to restore a measure of bipartisanship. I think part of the challenge is for the Republican Party to figure out its future and to decide whether it's going to remain the party of Trump, in which case we're probably not going to get a lot of bipartisan cooperation, or whether we will see it begin to try to move in a more moderate direction that could allow some cooperation across the aisle. We'll know more, I think, as this year progresses. But in the absence of the longer term repair that Michael and I have been discussing, I think Biden's best strategy is to try to go out and build winning coalitions on discrete issues, including on foreign policy. I think you can find, for example, a log roll between Democrats who like alliances because they're multilateral and Republicans who like alliances because it allows the United States to offload some commitments. I think you can find an alliance perhaps on immigration between a left that's committed to it more on principle and Republicans that may see it as important for the business community. I think you could find an alliance between evangelical Republicans and Democrats on climate change. So I think if in the absence of the repopulation of the American center, and that will take time, right? That will require the success of Biden's domestic agenda. I think he should go out and try to build log rolls, coalitions that span the political divide as he tries to get legislation through on these discrete, separate issues.
Great. So going a little bit further on that, given that you would advise the Biden administration to focus on domestic issues, how might outside observers tell the difference between Trump's America First priorities and Biden's domestic issues first agenda? Will it only be in terms of tone and style?
Excellent question. I would put it this way, that Biden should put Americans first. He just shouldn't call it America First. He should call it, whatever he wants to. A foreign policy for the middle class, I guess, is the phrase that he used in his first foreign policy speech on February 4, I think it was. But in some respects, I think that he needs to borrow some pages from the Trump playbook. Some of the Trump playbook has to be burned, and he's already burned it, right? As Michael and I were discussing, the isolation of the United States from international teamwork has been enormously destructive, not only in delivering good outcomes, but in leaving our allies estranged, scratching their heads, thinking, what has happened to the United States? I think it's been a grievous setback for the United States and the world that the US spent 4 years missing in action when it came to standing up for human rights, when it came to standing up for the rule of law, especially at a time when Russia and China are attempting to push out a liberal alternative. And so, on those areas, I think that Trump's America First was a disaster. But there are other areas where I think that putting Americans first will mean continuing to reduce the strategic footprint in the Middle East, will mean prioritizing investment in the domestic economy, will mean easing off on free trade, or at least making sure that if we do negotiate trade deals, those trade deals work to the advantage of working Americans and not just big multinational corporations. They need to work for farmers. They need to work for workers in the industrial heartland. That's how you go about rebuilding American opportunity and American optimism and the political center. And so I think that let's call it something nice. Let's put a nice face on it. But we do need to make sure that we address the domestic agenda first and foremost. That's the best way to make sure that the Trump era is no more than a dark detour in the nation's history.
Let me just jump in. Charlie, how's foreign policy for the middle class work for you?
As a
as a tagline, as a way of kind of presenting a foreign policy that's focused on improving the lives of Americans. And do you see that concept beginning to sort of take shape?
Yeah, I mean, that works for me. You know, is it like really catchy? Are we going to do the jig when we hear those words? I don't know about that, but I think it's substantively the right message, right? It's a way of saying, hey, Americans, we're going to pursue a foreign policy that works for you, right? We hear you. We're going to make sure that what we do is in the self-interests of the American people, all the American people, and not just a few American people. Because there really is, I think, a sense that you know, we've been living through a period in American history in which, sure, globalization and free trade and Pax Americana has enriched the nation, but in a very unequal way, and in a way that has led to both economic and cultural divides. And so I think you have to go back and say, you know, our engagement in the world will help you. It will speak to you. It will raise your standard of living. It will raise your wages. It will make you healthier. It will give you a job. I mean, that connective tissue is key. And so I think Biden gets it. The question that we all need to keep an eye on right now is, can they go from getting it to making it happen?
That's great. So circling back to something that you mentioned earlier regarding sort of withdrawal from the Middle East is this questioner wants to know a little bit more about your thoughts on Syria in particular, given how the conflict there has impacted immigration to EU, you know, which is one of our important partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, Syria is a tragedy. It still is a tragedy when it comes to loss of life, when it comes to suffering. It's also turned into a kind of zone of rivalry, right? You've got the Turks in northern Syria and in Idlib. The Iranians are running around supporting different militias. The Russians have moved in. The Israelis are worried about southern Syria and potential attacks. They're worried about arms flowing from Iraq into Syria, into Lebanon. So it's a real mess. And I think one of the mistakes that Trump made was that he disengaged diplomatically. He basically took the US out of the game, in addition to trying to get US troops out. And you know, my notion for the broader region is no more land wars. We can do what we need to do from offshore platforms with air power, with standoff counterterrorism forces, but we need to compensate for our withdrawal or our downsizing militarily by getting more into the game politically and diplomatically. And that includes on the migration front. And the person who asked the question is right to point out that in some ways, the gravest threat to the United States stemming from the civil war in Syria came from migration. And it happened in 2015 when millions of migrants went from Turkey to Greece and into the European Union. And if that had not been stopped, I don't think the European Union would exist today. And one of our key allies, perhaps our key ally in the world, our European allies, may have all been governed by populists, because there was a very serious reaction to the level of migration coming into the European Union. Now that's generally been stopped. And to put it rather bluntly, it's been stopped in a not very moral way. We've bribed Erdogan, the president of Turkey, to keep the Syrians there. We're now not we, but the EU is bribing militias in Libya to prevent migrants from getting on boats and going to Italy or Spain. But they're doing this because they feel that if they don't do it, it will be game over politically. So the longer term challenge here is, let's try to make sure that we don't let Syria's happen. Let's try to get ahead of the curve, take preventive steps to avoid these kinds of wars. And let's be very careful about doing things like knocking off the leaders of countries when the end result is, for example, in Libya, we contributed to the creation of a failed state.
That's great. So staying in that region, can you expand upon what you would advise the administration to do, or talk a little bit about what you see happening in Israel and Palestine?
You know, I think, as you may have gathered, I'm not a huge Trump supporter. I've been very subtle about it, but I'm not a huge Trump supporter. But I do think that he deserves credit where credit is due. And the negotiation of normalization between Israel and a number of countries, particularly in the Gulf region, but beyond the Gulf region, is a big deal. And I think his administration deserves credit for that. And Biden is right to stand by those agreements and to try to further integrate Israel into the broader Middle East. I think that Trump made a mistake on the Palestine-Israel conflict. He ended up essentially having no real diplomatic contact with the Palestinians, and really kind of letting that side of the situation in the region deteriorate from neglect. I think the Biden team is going back to support for a two-state solution, and that, to my mind, is the responsible position. The Palestinians have already responded by returning to dialogue with the United States, but I have to say I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to see progress. My read on politics on the Israeli side and politics in the Palestinian community, it doesn't suggest that we are in earshot or stone's throw of a meeting of the minds. So I'm comfortable with the U.S. going back to support for a two-state solution. I'm not particularly confident it's going to make much of a difference.
Great. So shifting over to a different region, this attendee wants to know, do you think some form of decoupling from China is workable, and would that help the middle class, the American middle class, I should specify?
It depends. I mean, if the question is some decoupling, the answer is yes. If the answer is significant decoupling, the answer is definitively no. And so I would expect to see the repatriation of supply lines on a fairly narrow list of sensitive technologies. So Huawei and 5G, in general, high-end communications technology, surveillance technology, artificial intelligence, semiconductor production, rare earth minerals. I think the US is going to be sensitive to looking either to itself or to allies for those kinds of materials. Medical equipment is another area where I think we learned the hard way that we relied heavily on China at a time when the pandemic was spreading. So yes, in those areas, I think you'll see some decoupling, but we're not going to go back to a kind of bloc world similar to the Cold War, when there was the Western capitalist bloc and the Soviet socialist bloc. We're way past that. The Chinese economy is way too integrated into the global economy and too integrated with our economy. And so I don't think we will see decoupling. But what I do think we should see is a lot of pressure from Biden, with the help of allies, to get China to embrace a more level playing field, stop stealing intellectual property, open up the Chinese market, because China has used unfair trade practices to its advantage. And yes, American workers can export more to China. They should export more to China. In some ways, it's the big elephant in the room, the Asian market in general. So no, I don't expect to see decoupling. Yes, I think we should keep the pressure up on China to change its trade policies and do more to stimulate growth in the United States as well as global growth.
Let me just jump in on China. This is one of the areas where a collective allied response is so essential, and is largely the consensus view of at least most Democrats, and probably not more than a few Republicans. But it's also one area where, you know, this whole question of American credibility and the hangover from the Trump administration is still casts a shadow. So, you know, how do we interpret the EU-China investment agreement? What does that tell us about Europe's willingness to approach China collectively, and how difficult is it going to be to make that case to the Europeans persuasively?
You know, Michael, this comes back a little bit to our exchange earlier about, do our allies want to put all of their marbles in the Uncle Sam basket? And I think to some extent, you know, the world has changed, and the degree to which the French and the Germans and others are willing to slip back into being our junior partner or our wingman, that's changed. And I think we saw Merkel go ahead and conclude that investment agreement with China, in part because there is a sense that Europe needs to be more self-possessed, more willing to take a course independently of the United States, not against the United States, but to be a better partner and a more capable partner in the long run. And I'm all for that. I'm someone who believes that the stronger Europe is, the more geopolitical heft it has, the better the relationship will be with the United States, because we'll look to them for help. The one thing I would say about Biden's plan to create a united front of democracies when it comes to China is, it ain't going to be easy. And that there will be good days and there will be bad days. But, you know, if the Germans sell lots and lots of BMWs and Mercedes and Audis in China, which they do, they're going to want to have a good trading relationship with China. It's important to the German economy. We also see on Nord Stream 2, this is a pipeline that's coming in from Russia into Germany. And we've been telling them for years, from Obama to Trump to Biden, don't do this, don't do this. They're very close to finishing it. It's 94% done. And so there will be instances in which commercial interest, investment, manufacturing, sales are going to drive a wedge between the United States and its allies. And I think we're just going to have to learn to manage that and live with that, because that's the world that we live in.
So going back to Europe, will a post-Brexit UK be an asset in terms of US foreign policy? Will a non-EU global Britain still enjoy a meaningful, quote unquote, special relationship with the US, in your opinion?
I think that Brexit is unfortunate. I'm not someone who thought that it was good for Britain, good for the European Union, or good for the United States. We're all losers, to put it rather bluntly. That having been said, Brexit was a choice, free and fair choice of the British electorate. It's done, and now we need to learn to make the best of it. And I think that there will continue to be a special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. And that special relationship has deep roots that go back to the 19th century. And it's in part about a common history, a common culture, a common outlook on the world, a common language. You know, having worked a couple of times in the National Security Council, I can sort of say that if there was one country that I could call that would generally have a similar view to the view in Washington, it would be the UK. All right, there is an alignment there that comes from, I don't know where, maybe it's mystical. Now, that having been said, the EU is where the action is at because it aggregates European strength. Britain is now outside that bloc, and as a consequence, its relevance in the world is going down. Its ability to serve as a strong partner of the United States is going down. That's just a fact of life. So Brexit is, in some respects, an act of self-isolation. I would not use the term global Britain. I know that the Leave campaign liked it, but I think it's a misnomer. Is Britain going to go riding off into the sunset, and are its troops and its ships are going to show up all over the world? I don't think so. Is the US about to negotiate a free trade deal with the UK? I don't think so. So I think there was a lot of smoke and mirrors in the debate about the merits of Brexit. But let's make, as I said, let's make the most of it. Let's find ways to maximize cooperation between the US and the UK, and to maximize cooperation between the UK and the EU.
That's great. So I will take one more question from the audience before letting Michael have the last one, if he would like, and either of you can answer this. So we're going to go way back to the start of this conversation and talk about how this question is asking, would we have moved to multilateralism during World War II had Japan not, had Pearl Harbor not happened, had the attack on Pearl Harbor not happened in this alternate universe?
Yes, that's an interesting question. You know, let me begin by saying that even though Roosevelt, Franklin that is remembered as this great wartime leader, he was in the isolationist mainstream throughout the 1930s. He was on board for what were called a Neutrality Act, and there were a series of them throughout the 1930s that basically built a moat between the United States and trouble abroad. And in many respects, they were trying to avoid a repeat of World War I, when the US got dragged in to the war because German submarines began to sink US ships. And so the isolationism of the 1930s was extremely strong, and in my mind, extremely delusory. because we basically stood by as a passive bystander as Nazism and fascism swept Europe and Asia. We can't afford to repeat that mistake. Now, there are some historians who believe that Roosevelt, starting in 1939, was taking the US to war through the back door when he started to provide assistance to the British and others. And he did have to fight the America First Committee every step of the way. They did not want to get involved in providing military support to democracies fighting the Japanese and the Germans. But I found no evidence in my own research to support the claim that Roosevelt was interested in taking the country to war. In fact, he said explicitly time and again, I am aiding allies so that they can defend themselves, because if they fall, then the Germans are going to come here. So in many respects, this was a rationale for keeping the war away from America's shores. So to directly answer the question, had it not been for the Japanese bringing the war to the United States, I'm not sure that we would have entered World War II. And had that not happened, the isolationists probably would not have been defeated, because they were defeated only on December 7, 1941. The America First Committee immediately disbanded. So in some respects, I guess we have the Japanese to thank us for American liberal internationalism and multilateralism, because it is what really shocked the United States out of its isolationist cocoon.
Well, so 5 minutes left, and I'm going to ask one more question that's sort of an extension of the one you just answered, which is that we know that grand strategy changes sometimes because of changes in presidencies, but also obviously because of shocks, surprises. So, if you can imagine, I think we're at this inflection point. I think you use that terminology in your book. But let's imagine a Pearl Harbor-like event. I can imagine several possibilities, from terrorist attacks to, conflict with China, et cetera. Would we have the capacity at this point to respond to that kind of event with as much creativity and courage as we did in 1941?
Well, I think that the rise of China, even though it is not a bolt from the blue, it's not a 9/11, it's not a strike on Pearl Harbor, is the big geopolitical development of our time. It's changing the world. And I do believe that it's one of the factors that is going to keep the United States engaged. There is a bipartisan consensus in a town where it's very difficult to find bipartisanship that the United States does need to deal with the rise of China and the geopolitical, economic, political implications of that development. And that will keep the country basically internationalist. In terms of some unforeseen event, a terrorist attack, that kind of thing, I think that the most important lesson I take away from 9/11 is don't overdo it.
Yeah.
Right. In many respects, we over-responded to the shock of 9/11, and that is what led to the so-called forever wars. And the so-called forever wars, in part, gave us Donald Trump. And so, in some strange way, you could argue that the terrorists got a little bit of what they wanted by creating a situation in which the United States became deeply divided and very dysfunctional politically. And so I guess steady as she goes. Let's get our house in order and deal with the rise of China. And if we are unfortunate enough to sustain some kind of attack, an unforeseen attack, let's respond in a measured and in an appropriate way. Let's not overreact, and because I think that is part of the problem that we faced after 9/11. But I'll end, Michael, with what I think is the one of the takeaways of our conversation today, and that is, foreign policy starts at home, and that right now we need to come together as a country. We need to fix the problems that led to the Trump era, and hopefully bring America's political center back to life. Because if we don't get it right at home, we're not going to get it right abroad. And so, I'm someone who believes that right now we need to focus like a laser on our domestic agenda, even if it to some extent comes at the expense of our engagement abroad. Because if we don't get it right here, we're never going to get it right when it comes to the rise of China or Russian interference in elections or whatever other challenge we face abroad. So first things first, let's fix our problems at home, and then I'm pretty confident we'll be able to address problems abroad.
Oh, that's a great conclusion to a terrific evening, Charlie. Thanks so much. I too regret that we couldn't do this face to face, but this is not forever. Let's hope we sort of reclaim the ability to actually be in each other's presence when this is all over.
That would be great, and maybe even throw in some good food and some good wine on top of it.
You got it. You got it. And thank you, Michelle, for putting this together.
Yeah, and let me thank you, Michael and Michelle, for hosting this event tonight. It's been a pleasure to join you and the participants.
Good.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you to everyone who attended. As I just mentioned in the chat, we'll be sending out a follow-up message shortly with a link to the recording to tonight's event. So if you missed any portion of it, there you will be able to view the video afterwards. So thank you again to Professors Oppenheimer and Kupchan, and we hope to see you at a virtual event soon, and hopefully on site at the Woolworth Building in the not too far future. So thank you and have a great evening.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.